This girl goes up to a millionaire and reveals a shocking secret about his wife. She has 3 husbands, the girl said. But when the millionaire discovers the truth behind it, it's something worse than he ever imagined. Comment giving a rating from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled with all the splendor that only New York City could offer on its gala nights. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light on the ladies' elegant evening gowns and the gentlemen's impeccable tuxedos, while the scent of white roses and French champagne lingered in the air. It was the most anticipated charity gala of the year, bringing together the city's elite to support underprivileged children in the region. Veronica Sterling delicately adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck, observing with discreet satisfaction how guests greeted her with reverence. At 42, she had earned the respect of New York society as the devoted wife of Richard Sterling, the prosperous textile magnate who modernized the region's industries without losing its roots. Her navy blue dress accentuated her blonde hair, styled in an elegant updo, and her gentle smile charmed everyone who approached. Richard, imposing at 48, chatted with other businessmen about the prospects for the textile industry next quarter. His meticulous and controlling personality, which made him one of the most respected men in the region, shone through in the way he mentally organized every conversation, every handshake, every detail of the evening. For him, this gala represented more than charity. It was a demonstration of the moral solidity of his family, built on 15 years of exemplary marriage. The small local orchestra played a soft waltz when the first sign that something was wrong echoed through the hall. A growing murmur began near the main entrance, where the security guards seemed to be dealing with some unusual situation. Veronica frowned slightly, her hand instinctively reaching for her husband's arm. "Let her in. She needs food." The childish voice cut through the refined air like a blade, echoing among the hushed conversations of the 200 guests present. All eyes turned to the entrance, where a girl of about 4 years old, with dirty clothes and disheveled brown hair, pushed with surprising determination against the guards who were trying to stop her from entering. Isabella had spent 3 days on the streets of New York, surviving on scraps of food found in trash cans and sleeping under awnings. Her little hands were bruised from searching for shelter, and her large eyes carried a sadness that no child should know. The aroma of fine food coming from the hotel had guided her hungry steps there, but it wasn't just hunger that motivated her. "My God, a child," murmured a lady nearby, placing her hand on her chest. Silence gradually took over the hall as Isabella walked with small but determined steps across the red carpet, her bare feet contrasting brutally with the luxury around her. Veronica felt a strange tightness in her chest. There was something familiar about that child, something that awakened memories buried long ago. She took a step forward, moved by a maternal instinct she didn't fully understand. "Honey, are you lost?" asked Veronica, squatting to be at the girl's height. Her voice carried a genuine kindness that made several guests smile, admiring the compassion of the night's first lady. Isabella looked up at Veronica, and for a moment that seemed eternal, the two stared at each other in silence. Then the girl opened her small torn backpack and removed 3 yellow documents, holding them with trembling hands. "You're the lady from the papers," said Isabella in her crystal-clear voice, extending the documents to Veronica. "I saw you hiding them on the park bench. You dropped them when you were running." Veronica's world collapsed in a split second. She immediately recognized the document she had lost 3 months ago during one of her morning runs. Papers she had kept for years, as a reminder of a phase of her life she believed was buried forever. Her hands trembled as she recognized the 3 marriage certificates she had hidden in the back of a drawer, documents she never imagined would see the light of day again. Richard approached worriedly upon seeing his wife's sudden pallor. "Veronica, what's going on? What papers are these?" His voice sounded distant to Veronica's ears, as if coming from far away. She knew she was about to lose everything she had built, the entire life carefully woven over 15 years. But Isabella had already opened the documents, her small, skillful hands flipping through the pages with a devastating, childish curiosity. "This one has your name on it," said Isabella, pointing to the first certificate. "And this one too. And this one too." But the names of the guys are different. The silence in the hall became deafening. 200 people held their breath as reality revealed itself through the innocence of a hungry child. Richard took the documents from Isabella's hands, his eyes quickly scanning the information that would destroy his existence as he knew it. First certificate, Veronica Sterling and Richard Sterling, married for 15 years in New York. Second certificate, Veronica Shaw and Dimitri Shaw, married for 12 years in the Hamptons. Third certificate, Veronica Baker and Nicholas Baker, married for 8 years in Connecticut. Tears began to stream down Veronica's face, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of relief mixed with absolute terror. The secret she had carried for so long had finally been exposed, and she didn't know if she felt freedom or condemnation. Richard looked at his wife with an expression he had never seen before. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was total incomprehension, as if he were looking at a stranger who had shared his bed for 15 years. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but laden with a pain that cut deeper than any scream. The guests began to move restlessly, some approaching to better understand the situation, others recoiling in discomfort. The murmur grew into a general buzz that echoed through the walls of the hall. Isabella, realizing that she had caused some kind of problem, began to cry softly. Veronica, even amidst her own despair, squatted again and hugged the girl, feeling an inexplicable connection with that child who had destroyed and possibly saved her life at the same time. "Don't cry, honey," whispered Veronica in Isabella's ear. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just told the truth." But as she comforted the girl, Veronica knew that the truth was much more complicated and painful than anyone in that hall could imagine. The documents in Richard's hands were just the tip of an iceberg that concealed decades of suffering, fear, and desperate decisions she had made to survive. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hall as 3 men crossed the main entrance almost simultaneously, as if an invisible thread had pulled them to that place at the exact moment when their lives would cross forever. Dimitri Shaw crossed the hall with hesitant steps, his artist's hands trembling slightly as he watched the scene unfold before his eyes. At 51, he had developed an acute sensitivity to capture human emotions through their expressions, a skill he used in his paintings in his spare time. But nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. He had received a strange call from a journalist friend an hour earlier, saying that his wife Veronica was involved in some kind of scandal at the Plaza Hotel. Initially, Dimitri had laughed at the suggestion. His Veronica was a dedicated woman who often traveled for work as a sustainability consultant, but always returned to him with enchanting stories of her travels and renewed affection. Now, seeing her hugging a dirty child in the middle of the most elegant hall in New York, while a man who was clearly her husband held documents with a shocked expression, Dimitri felt the world spin around him. Nicholas Baker entered the hall almost at the same time, his rigid farmer's posture contrasting with the refined environment. At 46, he had built his life based on pragmatism and straightforward honesty, values he had learned working the land since he was young. The call he had received from an acquaintance in the city had been equally cryptic, but something in his heart had compelled him to come and check it out personally. When Nicholas saw Veronica, his wife of 8 years, the gentle woman who visited his farm in Connecticut every weekend, always bringing a new sustainability project to implement, hugging a child while 2 men watched her with expressions of total bewilderment, he instantly understood that his life had just changed forever. The 3 men met in the center of the hall without realizing it, forming an invisible triangle around Veronica and Isabella. The heavy silence was broken when Richard looked up from the documents and saw the two strangers approaching. "Are you—" Richard began, but the words died in his throat when he recognized the names on the certificates in the faces of the men before him. "Dimitri Shaw," said the taller man, extending his hand in an automatic gesture of courtesy that he immediately regretted. "I believe we need to talk." "Nicholas Baker," presented the third man, his voice laden with a tense calm that hid a whirlwind of emotions. "And from what I'm seeing, we've all been deceived by the same woman." Veronica stood up slowly, still holding Isabella's hand, who had stopped crying but watched the adults with large, frightened eyes. The circle of guests had widened, but maintained a respectful distance, all fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. "I can explain," said Veronica, but her voice came out as a broken whisper. How could she explain 20 years of carefully constructed lies? How could she make 3 good men understand the desperate circumstances that had led her to create a triple life? "Explain?" Richard's voice rose an octave, attracting even more attention. 15 years, Veronica. 15 years of marriage that I thought was real. 15 years sleeping next to a stranger. Dimitri took a step forward, his sensitive nature making him instinctively protect the woman he loved, even in the face of evident betrayal. "Richard, this is not how we should deal with this. There's a child present." "A child who exposed the truth that we couldn't see," retorted Nicholas, but his tone was more reflective than angry. "Maybe we should thank her." Isabella squeezed Veronica's hand, feeling the tension around her. In her 4-year-old mind, she didn't fully understand what she had caused, but she realized that the adults were suffering. There was something familiar in the pain she saw in Veronica's eyes, a sadness that she recognized from her own nightmares. "I found the papers in Central Park," said Isabella suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension. "You were running and crying. I saw them fall out of your bag." Everyone turned to the girl, but it was Veronica who felt the full impact of those words. She remembered that morning 3 months ago, when she had received a terrifying call that made her run desperately through the streets of New York. A voice from the past, a name she hadn't heard in decades, had resurfaced to haunt her. "Who are you, girl?" asked Richard, his voice softer now, as if he finally realized that Isabella was also a victim in this situation. "I'm Isabella," she replied simply. "I don't have a home. I sleep on the street since Grandma Rose left." Veronica's heart broke upon hearing those words. There was something in that child's story that echoed her own childhood, the years of abandonment and fear that had shaped her into the woman she had become. Hope Muller, who had watched the whole scene from the back of the hall, approached silently. At 67, she had dedicated her life to helping needy children through the local Lutheran church, and her maternal instincts were on high alert. "Excuse me," she said with a still perceptible German accent, addressing the 4 adults. "This child needs immediate care. She is hungry and clearly traumatized." Hope squatted at Isabella's height, her calloused but gentle hands caressing the girl's dirty face. "Mein Kleines, would you like to come with me? I have hot soup at home and a clean bed where you can sleep." Isabella looked at Veronica as if asking for permission. There was an inexplicable connection between them, a mutual recognition of pain and survival that transcended logic. "Go with Miss Hope," said Veronica softly. "She will take good care of you." But as Isabella began to walk away with Hope, she turned and ran back to Veronica, hugging her legs tightly. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked with a childish sincerity that brought tears to the eyes of several spectators. "I'm going to be okay," lied Veronica, stroking the girl's disheveled hair. "Thank you for finding my papers." As Hope led Isabella away from the chaos, the 3 men and Veronica stood alone in the center of a circle of curious onlookers. The weight of the silence was suffocating, laden with years of true love that now seemed built on lies. "We need to get out of here," said Dimitri, looking around at the eager faces of the guests. "This isn't a conversation to be discussed in public." "My place," offered Richard automatically, before realizing the irony of inviting his wife's other husbands to his own residence. Or maybe a neutral location is better. Joe Allen on 46th Street, suggested Nicholas. Closes at midnight. We can talk in private. Veronica nodded silently, knowing she had no choice. The secret that had protected her for so many years was now exposed, and she would have to face the consequences of her decisions. As the four headed for the exit, none of them noticed the elderly man watching them from a table in the corner of the hall. Rudolf Steinbach, at 70, had arrived in New York that very afternoon, following clues that had led him to Veronica after decades of searching. Seeing his former wife surrounded by three men who clearly loved her awakened in him an anger he hadn't felt in years. He had come to reclaim what was rightfully his, but now he realized that the situation was much more complex and interesting than he had imagined. He smiled coldly, putting away his cell phone after discreetly photographing the scene. Those images could be very useful in the coming days. Joe Allen was almost empty when the four arrived, with only a few college students occupying distant tables. They chose a table in the back, where they could talk without being overheard. 20 years, began Veronica, her hands trembling as she held the cup of coffee that had cooled without her noticing. I've been living this life for 20 years, and in all those years I never stopped loving each of you. It was a confession that sounded impossible, but there was a sincerity in her voice that made the three men hesitate before bursting into accusations. There was something deeper in that story, something they didn't yet understand. The silence that followed Veronica's confession seemed to last an eternity. Richard nervously drummed his fingers on the wooden table, his analytical mind trying to process information that defied all logic. Dmitri watched the expressions on Veronica's face with the keen eye of an artist, looking for clues to the truth behind her words. Nicholas remained motionless, his pragmatic nature struggling against the contradictory feelings that consumed him. How? The word came out of Dmitri's mouth as a whisper laden with pain. How did you manage to love us all and lie to us at the same time? Veronica closed her eyes, breathing deeply, before beginning to tell a story she had never shared with anyone. My real name is Catherine Zimmerman. I was born in upstate New York into a family that should never have existed. Her hands trembled as she rummaged in her bag, pulling out an old and worn identity card. My father was an alcoholic and violent. My mother disappeared when I was 10 years old. At 16, I couldn't take the beatings, the threats, the constant hunger anymore. Richard felt a pang in his chest as he saw the genuine pain in the eyes of the woman he had loved for 15 years. Even betrayed, he couldn't ignore the suffering that emanated from her. I ran away from home with only the clothes on my back, continued Veronica. For 2 years, I lived on the streets of New York City, sleeping in shelters when I could get a spot, working at any job that would take me. That's when I met John Parker. Nicholas frowned upon hearing the name. The private investigator? Not then, replied Veronica with a bitter smile. He was just a young man of 20 who worked in a notary's office. He was the one who helped me get my first fake documents, not out of malice but out of compassion. He saw a desperate girl who needed an identity to get a job. The revelation fell like a bomb on the three men. John Parker was known in the region as an upright professional, respected for his honesty. Discovering that he had helped Veronica decades ago added a layer of complexity to the situation that none of them expected. I created the identity of Veronica Schneider first, she continued, her eyes lost in painful memories. I got a job as a cleaner in a hotel in the Catskills. That's where I met Klaus Weber, a man of 40 who seemed to genuinely love me. Dmitri felt his stomach churn. There were more men in Veronica's life, more lies to uncover. Klaus was kind, patient. For the first time in my life, I felt safe. We got married after a year of dating. I was only 19 and believed I had finally found my place in the world. She paused, wiping away a tear that insisted on running down her cheek. For 3 years I was happy. Klaus treated me like a princess, never questioned my past, gave me love and stability. Then one winter morning, he simply didn't wake up. Heart attack. I was alone again. The cafe had become even quieter, with only the distant sound of traffic penetrating through the windows. The three men processed each word, beginning to understand that the woman before them carried traumas much deeper than they had imagined. "After Klaus left, I panicked," confessed Veronica. "I couldn't deal with the loneliness, with the fear of going back to being that abandoned girl on the streets. That's when I made my first conscious mistake." Richard leaned forward despite his anger, unable to ignore the vulnerability in her voice. "I moved to New York and created a new identity, Veronica Sterling. I got a job at your company, Richard. You were so safe, so stable. You represented everything I had lost with Klaus. When you started to notice me, I fell in love with the security you offered. But you were already married to me when you met Dimitri," murmured Richard, connecting the dates in his mind. "Yes," admitted Veronica, her voice breaking. 3 years after our wedding, I still had nightmares about my childhood, panic attacks you never knew about. On one of your business trips, I ended up in the Hamptons looking for a therapist. That's where I met Dimitri. Dimitri clenched his fists, remembering that day perfectly. Veronica had appeared in his art studio, saying she was interested in buying a painting. Her eyes carried a sadness that had touched him deeply. "You had this artistic sensitivity, this ability to see beyond appearances," said Veronica, looking directly at Dimitri. "With me, you were kind in a way I had never experienced. It wasn't the protection that Richard offered, it was understanding." "And Nicholas?" asked the farmer, his voice controlled but tense. 5 years later, I was in Connecticut for a real sustainability consulting gig when I met you. You had this brutal honesty, this connection with the earth that made me feel genuine, like I could go back to being the Catherine I had lost so long ago." Nicholas shook his head, struggling to process the information. "So during all these years, you created separate identities for each of us. Different documents, different last names, even separate bank accounts. Veronica Sterling for Richard, Veronica Shaw for Dimitri, Veronica Baker for Nicholas. Each one only existed when I was with you. The confession was simultaneously impressive and devastating. The complexity of the emotional and practical logistics that Veronica had maintained for years left the three men stunned. "The business trips," murmured Richard, finally understanding. "They were visits to you. When you said you were traveling for work, you were going to the Hamptons to be with Dimitri, or to Connecticut with Nicholas. I created a fictitious consulting firm to justify the absences." Dimitri felt nauseous as he realized how many times he had questioned why Veronica couldn't stay longer with him, why she always had to travel to other clients. Every time she had left broke his heart a little more, without him knowing she was going into the arms of another man. "But why?" exploded Nicholas finally. "Why didn't you just choose one of us? Why did you build this web of lies?" Veronica looked at each of them, her eyes filled with a pain that seemed ancient and deep. "Because each of you gave me something I had lost in childhood. Richard gave me security, Dimitri gave me understanding, Nicholas gave me authenticity. I was 3 different people because I never learned to be a complete person." Silence returned to dominate the table. Each man processed not only the betrayal, but the emotional complexity of the woman they had loved. There was something deeply tragic in Veronica's confession, a wounded child who had grown up without learning to be whole. "And now?" asked Dimitri, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What do we do with this truth?" Before Veronica could answer, her cell phone vibrated. The message that appeared on the screen made all the blood drain from her face. It was from a number she hadn't seen in 20 years, a number that should be dead and buried along with her past. "Catherine, my dear wife, I saw you at the hotel today. I finally found you. We need to talk about what you owe me. Tomorrow, noon, Central Park. Come alone, or your new husbands will find out things much worse about you. R.S." Veronica dropped her cell phone on the table, her hands trembling violently. The 3 men saw the absolute terror take over her face, an expression of primitive fear that was very different from the vulnerability she had shown during her confession. "Who is R.S.?" asked Richard, picking up the cell phone to read the message. "My first husband. whispered Veronica, her voice almost inaudible. "The man who forced me to marry him at 17. The man I ran away from, and who I thought couldn't find me anymore." The final revelation hit the three men like lightning. There was a fourth husband, a marriage that predated all the others, and from the tone of the message, this man represented a danger that none of them fully understood. As Veronica broke down in silent tears, the three men looked at each other across the table, realizing that the night had revealed only the surface of a mystery much darker and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The morning arrived heavy as lead over New York City. Veronica had spent the night sleepless at Hope Mueller's house, where she had taken refuge after the devastating conversation at the cafe. The German lady had opened her doors without hesitation, understanding instinctively that a woman in despair needed safe shelter. Isabella slept soundly in the next room, for the first time in weeks, in a clean and warm bed. During the night, the girl had woken up with nightmares and sought comfort in Veronica's lap, creating a bond that transcended any logical explanation. "Mein Kind," said Hope softly, serving breakfast to Veronica. "You don't have to face this man alone." But Veronica knew she had no choice. Rudolf Steinbach was not the kind of man who accepted being ignored, and his message had made it clear that he knew about Richard, Dmitri, and Nicholas. If she didn't show up, he could do something much worse than simply exposing her lies. At 11:30, Veronica arrived at Central Park with her heart pounding erratically. The park was bustling with families enjoying the sunny Saturday, children running among the old trees, elderly couples feeding pigeons. The normality of the scene contrasted brutally with the terror she felt. Rudolf Steinbach was sitting on the same bench where Isabella had found the certificates months ago. At 70, he still maintained the intimidating posture that had terrified Veronica decades ago, although time had added deep wrinkles to his face and grey to his hair. "Catherine," he said as she approached, using the name she had tried to bury forever. "Still beautiful after all these years. The money you stole from me was well invested, from what I see." Veronica sat on the opposite end of the bench, keeping as much distance as possible. "I didn't steal anything. I took what was rightfully mine after 2 years of abuse." "Abuse?" Rudolf laughed bitterly. "I gave you a roof, food, protection. You were a street girl when I found you. You should thank me." The memories came back like an avalanche. The forced marriage when she was 17, the nights of terror, the bruises she hid under long sleeves, the money she had secretly saved to escape. Rudolf had obtained temporary custody of her through falsified documents when she was still a minor, promising the authorities that he would take care of the young orphan. "What do you want?" asked Veronica, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My $50,000, he replied simply. "With interest, it's 300,000 today. Or I can tell your 3 husbands about our special honeymoon." Veronica's blood ran cold. There were things about those 2 years of marriage that she had buried so deeply in her mind that she sometimes doubted if they had really happened. "I don't have that money," she said, but her voice betrayed her despair. "Of course you do. A rich businessman, a successful artist, a prosperous farmer. 3 men who would do anything for the woman they love." Rudolf leaned closer, his presence making Veronica cower. "Until they find out what you really are." It was at that moment that Richard, Dmitri, and Nicholas appeared in the park. The 3 had spent the night talking, processing the revelation about Veronica's past, and had decided that they would not let her face her first husband alone, regardless of how they felt about her. "Ah, the 3 musketeers," mocked Rudolf as he saw them approaching. "I came to meet the men foolish enough to fall in love with the same woman." Richard took a step forward, his protective posture surprising even himself. "Who are you, and what do you want with Veronica?" "I'm Rudolf Steinbach, the first and only legitimate husband of Catherine here," he smiled coldly. "Your marriages are all null and void, technically. She never divorced me." The revelation hit the 3 men like a punch in the stomach. Not only had they been betrayed, but their marriages didn't even exist legally. "And that's not true," protested Dmitri, but his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, but it is," said Rudolph, taking documents from his briefcase. "Here's our marriage certificate, dated 1999, and here's proof that there was never a divorce." Catherine simply disappeared like a thief in the night. Veronica was trembling violently now, 20 years of suppressing traumatic memories collapsing on her. "Tell them why I ran away," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell them about the bruises, about the threats, about what you did to me when you were drunk." "Tell them yourself," retorted Rudolph cruelly. "Tell them how you seduced an older man to get protection, how you lied about your age, how you stole my money and ran away like a criminal." But before Veronica could answer, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "She didn't run away like a criminal. She ran away like a survivor." Everyone turned to see Hope Muller approaching, holding Isabella's hand. The German lady had a determined expression that none of them had seen before. "Who are you?" asked Rudolph, annoyed by the interruption. "I am Hope Muller," she said with dignity. "And there's something you all need to know." Hope looked directly at Veronica, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Catherine, mine kind, I've been looking for you for 50 years. The world stopped around Veronica." "What are you saying?" "I am your mother," said Hope simply. "I didn't disappear when you were 10 years old. I was committed to a psychiatric hospital by your father after I tried to protect you from one of his rages. When I got out 2 years later, you had disappeared. I spent decades looking for Catherine Zimmerman." The revelation exploded like a bomb. In the center of the park, Veronica looked at the woman who had taken care of her the night before, looking for familiar traits that time and trauma had obscured. "How do you know?" she whispered. "The music," said Hope softly. "The music you hummed last night to Isabella. I used to sing that same song to you when you were a baby, and you have a crescent moon-shaped birthmark behind your left ear." Instinctively, Veronica brought her hand to the mark she had always hidden under her hair. It was a feature that none of her husbands knew, something she had learned to hide since childhood. Rudolph watched the mother-daughter reunion with growing irritation. "Very touching, but that doesn't change anything. She still owes me $300,000. "Actually," said a new voice, "you're the one who owes explanations." John Parker emerged from behind a tree, holding a folder full of documents. The private investigator who had helped Veronica decades ago was now there as a man of 55, his expression serious and determined. "John?" Veronica could barely process another surprise. "After you gentlemen contacted me yesterday," he said, addressing the 3 husbands, "I decided to investigate further. And I discovered very interesting things about Mr. Steinbach." John opened the folder and began to distribute documents. "First, the marriage between Rudolf Steinbach and Catherine Zimmerman is legally null and void because she was a minor and did not have legal authorization from her guardian. Second, Rudolf forged documents to obtain her temporary custody. Third, he has a history of 3 complaints for domestic violence from previous relationships." Rudolph paled. "These are lies." "And fourth," continued John relentlessly, "Catherine didn't steal any money. She withdrew her own inheritance that had been left by an aunt, an inheritance that you tried to hide from her." The evidence accumulated like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Veronica was not the fugitive criminal that Rudolph had painted. She was a victim who had found the courage to escape a predator. "Most importantly," said John, taking out a last document, "I found this in the New York notary's office, a petition for divorce that Catherine herself had filed at 18, shortly after her escape. The divorce was granted in absentia since Rudolph never appeared to contest. The silence that followed was deafening. All of Veronica's marriages were legal. All of Rudolph's accusations were false. The truth had finally emerged after decades buried under lies and manipulation. Rudolph stood up abruptly, realizing that his plan had collapsed. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his voice had lost all authority. "Actually, it is," said Nicholas, taking a step forward. "You're leaving New York today, and if we ever see your face around here again, We'll make sure the authorities are aware of your past activities." Rudolph looked at the three men united in protection of the woman they loved, at the reunited mother, at the child who had exposed the truth, and understood that he had lost. Without a word, he walked away from the park, disappearing forever from the lives he had tried to destroy. Isabella ran to Veronica and hugged her, her small presence reminding everyone that sometimes it is the children who bring the greatest truths to light. "And now?" asked Dmitri, looking at Veronica with a mixture of love and uncertainty. Veronica looked at each of the men she had loved, at the mother she had reunited with, at the child who had become part of her improbable family. "Now," she said softly, "we learn to be a real family without lies, without fear, because I discovered that true love doesn't need to be divided to be real." Under the New York City sun, 5 adults and a child began to build something that had never existed before, a family based on truth, forgiveness, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.